As Peter Craven is far too modest to introduce himself, I'd like to say a few words on a real cultural diplomat. Somebody who gained a degree in political science at York University, works as a teacher, translator and interpreter, and liked Germany so much he decided to stay here for 2 decades and make a career here in the media. I think all of you, particularly the Germans, will know Deutsche Welle, and Peter Craven is a leading light in the German news, Premier English news side. And, there's nobody really better qualified, I think, to moderate a discussion on German perception of the UK and the UK perception of Germany. So I'd like to hand over to Peter, and I'm hoping that my nice, kind words will mean he won't give me too many difficult questions for later on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, now it's my job to introduce the other guests. Some of them you've met already, the cheeky Nick Tolhurst, yeah, on my right, yeah. So Tony Brenton, the former British ambassador to Russia, who is a person who is qualified in very many different ways to contribute to today's debate. But I think on Germany, something of an outsider, and that I think is going to make him a very interesting person to listen to. Yeah. We also have Katrin, who you've met earlier. I think everybody's met here, so I don't have to introduce. And we then have Professor Dr. Gerhard Dannemann, who's the director of the Center for British Studies at the Humboldt University here in Berlin. I think his point of view is going to be very, very interesting in this debate. I'd like to begin by asking Sir Tony, in his capacity as a top diplomat and as a sometimes journalist himself, so very qualified to talk about international relations and to talk about the media. First of all, Sir Tony, is all well in relations between the UK and Germany, and to what extent do the media play a destructive or constructive role in the relationship?
Well, thank you, Peter, for picking on the most ignorant member of the panel to start with. If you just read the press, and especially the popular British press about Germany, you would think it was 1945 still, actually. The popular press's one memory of Germany is of the Second World War, and that is recycled and recycled and recycled in a deeply unhealthy and destructive way. I think, actually, though, most of the British people view it as entertainment than in any way as serious comment on UK-German relations. If you ask yourself how the more serious part of the British press and people regard Germany, then I think it's a much more constructive picture, actually. And Germany benefits from not having any very clear image in British eyes. It's not like the French, whom we all instinctively disapprove of. And it's not like the Americans, whom, on the whole, we tend to admire, even while wondering how on earth they've done it. The Germans are there, they are solid, they're European, they're friendly, they're rich, and all of that is admired. They views split, I suspect, according to how pro or anti-European you are, on how enthusiastic you are about German policy, and we may well come back to the European dimension. And I think in the recent context of all of the turbulence in the Middle East, which has been a fascinating testing ground for European unity and the European capacity to do effective things in a very challenging, fast-moving political situation, the Germans are seen in the UK as not having contributed as much as a country with that weight and wealth ought to have done. Does that give you enough to chew on to start with?
That gives me enough to go on with. I'd like to ask you a follow-up question. In your capacity as a former ambassador to Moscow, to what extent does what happens in the press on a day-to-day basis actually affect day-to-day diplomatic business?
Well, the answer to that is that ministers, democratically elected ministers, are of course obsessed by the press. They really care. Mostly they're obsessed about what the press says about them, but more generally they care about what the press says about British policy and their policies and so on. And therefore they do take press reactions and likely press reactions to particular policy announcements very seriously. But as I think about over my sort of Foreign Office career, where I never dealt directly with Germany, although I dealt with Europe an awful lot, and I dealt with environment an awful lot, where on the whole Germany were very progressive and on the good side of the arguments, I don't recall press coverage of particular countries directly influencing British policy towards them. I mean, that may not be true of Libya, but it's certainly true of Germany.
We shall come to talk about Libya shortly, and I think it is a very interesting case in point for some of the things that you've already begun to talk about. Katrin DiPaola, I'd like to just ask you, in your capacity as an academic and in your capacity with the DAAD, and as somebody, I'd also like to invite you, because you've also got the American perspective that you can bring into this to a certain extent. Just tell me what sort of potential there is that you are aware of for misunderstandings between the UK and Germany.
That's also a very good question for somebody who's more ignorant than you are, probably, as far as that is concerned. I think there are plenty of misunderstandings, and I think you referred to one already in the popular view that Germany is still stuck in the 1940s, basically, and I still think that this image is still prevalent throughout many public channels, as far as I can tell. I had a nice anecdote with my father-in-law, and that goes back to the United States. I'm sorry, not to Britain, but he is obsessed with the History Channel, and the History Channel is known for trying to get many people to watch its programs, horrific programs. And I found that the more Nazis you can connect with scientific UFO sightings, the higher the quota is. So one of the big misunderstandings about Germany is that the Nazis constantly developed things like flying objects and whatever to finally conquer the world war, and that still seems to be or hold true in the belief system of many outsiders outside of Germany, the common people that read the popular press. And I think on the other hand, Germans also have a lot of misconceptions about Britain, particularly going on these days with the royal wedding happening. They don't understand they probably don't understand the system, they probably don't understand the tradition fully, but they are amazed and completely involved in this spectacle that's happening in Great Britain. And I think that they think every single Brit has to kind of hail to the crown, and they all have to be, royalists and then completely fascinated by what is happening there. So I think there are a lot of misconceptions on the more popular level that I find than on the intellectual level that might deal more with political issues or global awareness.
Do you for a moment have any idea why these prejudices that people are obviously apparently rather comfortable with are perpetuated? Yeah.
I think we're in general always more comfortable with creating the other. And by creating all these images of the other that is so obviously other than what we are, we always feel comfortable in dealing with other cultures. And I think that's a very sort of normal reaction, that we always like to propel images rather than trying to figure out what is really behind the image. I don't know if that is an answer, but from a cultural studies point of view, to me, the creation of the other is clearly the reason behind propelling stereotypes, and particularly also in the media, and creating this other and really harping on the other sells, apparently, as far as popular media is concerned. I'm not talking about high culture at all, but my area was more popular culture to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Gerhard, Dannemann, if we are sitting here talking about perceptions of the perceptions and counter-perceptions traded back and forth between the UK and Germany in the media, if we're sitting here talking about that, does that mean that there is a problem?
That would be overstating it. I mean, by and large, I think Germans and Brits find each other in each other's comfort zones. Sir Paul Lever, former British ambassador to Germany, at a presentation he gave here in Berlin, divided Europe into wine drinkers, beer drinkers, and vodka drinkers, and the wine drinkers being the light-hearted people who live through the day and whatever, but are not quite as efficient. On the other front, the vodka drinkers who tend to be melodramatic, suicidal, and the dark thing, whatever, and then the sturdy beer drinkers, etc. And this is, of course, a cliche, but there's some truth to it. There's some truth to it. There is this other element, the jingoism, in the tabloid press. Probably started in Britain, but then was picked up by some German tabloids as well. Has receded, I think, since 2006, noticeably still there, but sort of more background noise, and not comprehended by Germans at all. Mm-hmm. What Germans do not realize is that this is no treatment reserved for Germans. It's just for anybody who is born and living outside the home counties. And sometimes even home counties like Essex are not doing so well. Anybody who's Mancunian, Liverpudlian, Georgian, what have you, God forgive, Irish, may I say, United States, that's the worst. That's a love-hate relationship. The others are clear hate relationships. And no one really takes it serious, but it's there. And it's serious enough that if you complain about it, then the worst thing which can happen to you in Britain will happen to you. You will be accused of having no sense of humor. That's the most serious remark you can get. Brits take their humor very seriously. Even more serious than German Karnevalsvereine, which is difficult. That's where there are some problem areas. There are also the stereotypes there. I mean, the stereotypes tend to be at least one generation back. We've just learned the British stereotypes are about 1945. The Germans are still somewhat in the bowler hat umbrella, Agatha Christie, middle-aged ladies drinking tea and this sort of thing, which is quite harmless but wrong anyway as well. That is probably being reduced by amount of mutual tourism, but it's still sort of the background picture, a projection, as you've said. I think this is sort of the analysis where we start from. So I think by and large a good and healthy relationship, but with some problem zones. If I can just sum it up, I spent 11 years of my life in the United Kingdom, out of which there were 5 days where I felt uncomfortable.
5 days?
Yeah, that was 2 days before and 3 days after the 1996 European Cup. The 2 days before, the head of my faculty at the time said, Gerhard, I won't speak to you for the next 2 days. I regret to say that for a few weeks afterwards he didn't speak to me either. But that was about the only time, I would think. And that's a sports event. It could happen. Having lived next to Arsenal pitch, I have to be an Arsenal supporter. It could happen between Manchester United and Arsenal supporters as well. So I'm not taking that too seriously.
We're talking about stereotypes. The word jingoism, and we've talked already about the Nazi period sometimes being mentioned, the Second World War being mentioned. I was just looking at my notes. I sat down this morning and sort of put together all the quotes that I've written down over the years, sort of from publications and from commentators and what have you, about the relations between Germany and the UK. And I can't find the specific one, but I know it is from the Daily Telegraph. It's not too long ago that at the end of an editorial there was the sentence, we are still a nation that is obsessed by the Second World War, and increasingly so. Yeah? Nick Tolhurst, could you begin perhaps to explain that for us?
I'll try, but I just want to say thank you very much to Mr. Dannemann. You did not miss the opportunity to mention 1996 all over again. Very, very kind words, but you still managed to get it in.
He didn't mention the words losing on penalties.
I think the problem is, and I think you touched on it earlier, Katrin, that there is a strange lack of curiosity. And if I can be slightly hard on some of the students here, I noticed this when I did my Erasmus year abroad, and then I wanted to do my master's in Germany. It wasn't just my grandparents who said, "Are you sure you want to go to Germany to live?" It was also my fellow students who were in their early 20s. And so I agree. I don't think it's necessarily that there's so much anti-Germanism from the Second World War in European society. I think there's a lack of curiosity, even amongst young people. Of course, I exclude the present company because being at the ICD, then it's clear that you're cosmopolitan and world curious. But this is what worries me. And I agree. I don't think, apart from the sun and a couple of days after rather lucky German penalties, I don't think that many British people actually view Germans the way that my grandparents do. And it's probably a good idea that my grandparents are not here today. The problem is we need to fill this vacuum. And I think maybe if I could put the lady from the DAD on the spot here, I've noticed that although the DAD do very good work, the dramatic decline in the number of students and even worse, number of school children learning German, this can't be put down to sort of the Second World War or a hang-up from this time. I think it's down to this lack of curiosity. And I think the important thing is maybe to try to bring British children, not students, but British children, a greater interest in what happened in Germany. Because if all you ever see about Germany is old 1940s war films, then this can't help but affect your understanding of what Germany might be like.
I'd still like to ask Tony the same question. I'd like what I found interesting in the quote from the Daily Telegraph was, this was relatively recent, a couple of years ago, the conclusion that Britain is a country that is, obsessed is perhaps not the right word, but certainly where the Second World War is the starting point for so much, and that is increasingly a tendency. The Daily Telegraph concluded. Why would that be the case?
Well, I think they're wrong. I mean, I simply don't believe it. We were talking about this in the green room before coming up here, and the UK goes through waves in its attitude to the rest of the world. And I'm an old man now, and I've lived through two and a bit of these waves. Back, if you think back, which none of you can, to the 1960s, and I know it sounds like prehistoric times to you, when dinosaurs still walked the earth, when Harold Wilson ruled the UK, and when the UK was doing very badly economically. It all culminated in a thing which you may dimly have heard of called the Winter of Discontent, when bodies went unburied and bins went unemptied. And the UK way of governing itself was demonstrably inferior and failing. Economic growth had been very poor. We'd lost the empire and didn't really work out what we were going to do with ourselves politically. And one of the consequences of that huge feeling of national inferiority and failure was a search for help from abroad, a search for foreign models and foreign engagements and foreign involvements which would help to solve our domestic problems. And it was in that time, of course, that we joined the EU and looked to Germany and other places for things like you were hearing this morning, more constitutional forms of governance, for example. Those sorts of ideas began to mature back then. And so we went through a period of feeling quite warm about Europe, attracted to it, including Germany, because we thought we had something to learn from it. And over time, the British began to feel better about themselves. And let me pin my political colours to the mast. I think this process reached fruition at about the end of Mrs. Thatcher's time as Prime Minister of the UK. Suddenly, the UK was growing economically faster than all of continental Europe. Suddenly, it had a national self-confidence in the way that it was governing itself, in the way that it was conducting its international relations. It was up there in the top league again. And suddenly, the UK felt that it didn't need Europe as much as it thought it had. It didn't need these alien continental models because it was doing very well itself. And that period ran until quite recently. So, the war, I guess, rose again as a model of how we'd been triumphant before, and here we were triumphant again. Now, we're entering, it seems to me, a very interesting phase about now. We've had the recession. Suddenly, the UK markets rule everything model is subject to serious question. Suddenly, we're doing significantly worse economically than Germany and other parts of continental Europe. Suddenly, there are serious questions about how the UK continental Europe comparison works. And it will be very interesting to see, therefore, in British public discourse and in British politics and in British attitudes to Europe, whether there is a reversion to seeking Germany, other countries, as a model, because we ourselves are no longer happy with how we're performing. But I don't think the Second World War has anything to do with it, other than as a marker of how we feel about ourselves in other ways.
I'd like to challenge that, but in a little while, when we perhaps move on to another sort of aspect of the discussion. Katrin, I'd like to ask you, because you mentioned earlier, when I arrived in the room and you were talking about the DAAD, you were talking about how you came back from New York and how you've come back to Germany. And so Tony has just been talking about the British, how the British began to feel more comfortable with themselves. What's your perception at the moment about how comfortable the Germans feel about themselves and how perhaps that is reflected in the media?
I've only been here for 6 months, so I can't really tell you if the Germans are extremely comfortable about themselves or not. But what I have realized is that after having been away for 15 years, there is a certain kind of, I don't want to say it's a German way, but you can be German again. Like when I left, it was a little bit more difficult to say, yeah, I'm German, and I wouldn't necessarily tell people I'm German. I'd rather say I'm Danish or whatever fits my curly, badly dyed blonde hair. But when I came back, and I think it has to do with the two last World Cups, that there is certainly a different feeling about being German. Also, our economy is doing fairly well. We have made some decisions, not very aggressive decisions. I said before, Germany's wonderfully boring, like Tony Judd said. We haven't, but it has been working very well for Germans. It's been 20 years since the reunification, and I think Germany is really on its way to kind of finding a way of defining itself. And I think that also the media abroad realizes that as well. I mean, I've found fewer and fewer articles in the New York Times that tied soccer necessarily to the Nazi era, but that applauded Germany for being strong in its economical decisions and for making the right decisions, particularly with the financial crisis. So I think that the image of Germany has definitely won a lot, and I think that Germans can feel that as well. I also, at the same time, believe that we still have a long way to go, because at the same time that I can read in the New York Times, we applaud Angela Merkel for making the right decisions, for not plunging the country into debt, and then still seeing images of Prince Harry having a swastika on his arm, or hearing from one of my students, from my friends, whose son went to school in Denmark and was greeted with Heil Hitler. So I mean, it's still very difficult. I think being German is still very difficult growing up as a German. But I also think that there are many efforts by the younger generation of finally figuring out who we are, given that we have the past that we did. So I certainly feel that there is a tremendous change. And I look at I don't want to say younger kids because, well, I can say younger kids. They could be my kids now. They behave differently. I mean, I feel like my generation, and I was born in the 70s, we were a little bit more cautious. And particularly being a German in New York City, I was also still very cautious because there is a very strong Jewish lobby, so to speak. And coming from a German department, we also always had to make sure to have an even balance of topics relating to the Holocaust. But I could also see that our interns that came would always ask me, well, why do you have that program? There are so many other things that are much more interesting, that are spannend. Why can't you do something else? Why do you always have to harp on, in a certain way, on the past? Why can't we maybe ask different questions? So I do, and for the past 6 months, again, I feel that we have bettered our image worldwide.
Gerhard Dannemann, so Tony was saying that perhaps the time has come for once again for the UK to look to Germany and the German model and see what can be learned. Is there a German model that you can map out for us?
Well, it probably wouldn't work in the UK if there was one. The last time this was tried was between Tony Blair and Gerhard Schröder when they met up, and Gerhard Schröder trying to bounce on Tony Blair's splendid success in the United Kingdom, trying to find some common ground. This usually starts to work out badly when the one side discovers that the way that the conservatives in Germany would run the labour market would be seen as somewhat leftist from the Labour Party in Britain. That's one, but this is a cornerstone of German society, and you're not going to change that. The Liberal Democrats have been trying hard recently, and you see where they are now. So in the doldrums in the polls, if you haven't watched. There's a few other things. Having said this, there are some elements where there has been learning from each other. The independence of the Bank of England, for instance, is, I think, following, well, it could be, it's not the only independent bank, but the German bank has deliberately made pretty strong independent. That was one of the first measures of the Blair government to make the Bank of England independent. Germany is trying hard not to adopt a minimum wage, but is gradually doing so, which is a UK thing. People are watching each other. An argument can actually be made these days. Look, it's worked in Britain. It could work in Germany, which it can or cannot, depending on circumstances. And I think you can say the same the other way around as well. So there is some room for learning, but the countries are, in spite of everything we've just said, structurally somewhat different. Different governments, different parliaments, as I explained this morning, and a different sort of public sentiment about what is European, different sentiment about how an economy should be run, how much state there is. The Scots are much more like the Germans in appreciating the role of the states, but the English certainly are not. And as there are about only 5 million Scots and about 50 somewhat million English, the relative weight of that in the public debate makes that less of a factor. So there are many bridges, but at every stage you would have to ask, can we transplant? Can it work? And that is a question which needs to be answered.
Would you agree with that, more or less, that the UK and Germany, that there are two very separate and distinct economic discourses going on, and that is very much reflected in the media?
Yes, I would. And I'd just quickly like to add one thing. I don't know how appreciated this is in Germany, but there's been a big debate about apprenticeships in Britain, and Germany's always held up as the shining example. And it's not just about the recession and less jobs for young people, but I think it's also the fact that the German system seems to work, whether in recession or in boom times, to really get young people to get ahead, qualifications, experience in a very efficient way. As for whether that's the perception in sorry.
Whether there are two very different media worlds, whether the difference in economic perspective is reflected in the media as well. My sense is that it is. That there are two very different ideologies, as it were. Well,
in a way that goes back to the first set of questions about the perception of Germany. I think one thing we left out, we always talk about the Second World War. And there's a very, I can't remember who said it, but I know there was a British politician said, when I cross the Atlantic and arrive on Calais, I realize I'm on the same piece of land as Vladivostok, which is, Vladivostok I'm sure is a very nice place, but the issue here, well, you would know better. I'm assuming it's a nice place, but I think it's a very important thing to how much being an island really is ingrained in our entire idea of ourselves, and that's also about economics and politics as well. Even if we don't think about the Second World War, we think, well, Europe is something over there, yeah? Whereas Germans and French and Dutch people think of this is Europe. And this also affects not just politics but economics. And I think it comes down to the fact that there are several discourses, but also inside Britain. We were talking earlier, Gerhard, you said about state involvement in the economy is perceived differently in Britain and Germany. I would say state involvement in the economy is perceived very differently inside Britain. I think there is a home counties, London, maybe stretching up as far as Oxford and Cambridge, has a very different understanding of an economic model than the North and Scotland, Wales, the West Country. And I think this rests on the fact, without going into professor mode here, I think that the way that the economy, political economy, has developed in Britain over hundreds of years as a trading nation, as a financial capital, has really affected the culture of the British Isles. Whereas, and so that everything is kind of centred on London, what's good for London trading, what's good for the empire, what was good for the financial centre is good for Britain. Whereas from the German perspective, Germany flourished as an industrial nation in the 19th century, and it was a different kind of thing. So I would say that these historical economic factors are far more important than even the Second World War, and they're so ingrained in our mentality, about being a nation of shopkeepers, as the French called us. So the economic discourse we're talking about is we're an island race. Everything, for example, the Euro or the European Union, it's not we don't want the Europeans to horribly fail. Well, apart from my grandfather, maybe. But we don't want the Europeans to horribly fail. We don't want the euro to go completely bankrupt. But it's that crazy project by those Europeans over there, Whereas we trust our banking system. We trust our trading potential with the world. And, the ambassador, Tony's fine, okay. You said about this change we had, or these waves. I would actually disagree with that. I would say it wasn't so much a wave in the 1970s which changed. It was a European window that opened for Britain, and we probably won't have those same sort of those times again. Even now, after recession, I think the Brits still have this perception that we are an economic Sonderfall. We're a particular case. We don't really belong to European mainstream economics.
Oh, so much of what you said speaks to me from the heart as somebody whose father was from Yorkshire and whose mother is from Scotland. Yeah. So, Tony, let me ask you this: the British people are more open to Europe than the British media. True or false?
Well, it depends which British people and which British media. He said evasively, like diplomats do. Large swathes of the British media, and we've already discussed this, are totally populist. The word Germany brings up Nazism on their computers, and they just write the automatic story, including football. But the best bits of the British media, which are of course British in where they originate, but are in effect read worldwide, including here in Germany. If you look at The Economist, if you look at the Financial Times, are very good on Europe, are very well informed, and are the stuff that's written by that is read by British decision makers and which feeds, I think, a quite accurate impression.
Isn't it very interesting that precisely the publications that are the most open-minded in the way, I'm not sure that's the right terminology, but in the way that you're describing, are precisely the publications like The Economist and the Financial Times that have a stronger financial bent?
Yeah, I don't think that's the point. I mean, they're very good as well on European politics. I mean, the Financial Times would deny vehemently that they're now principally a financial newspaper, actually. So bits of the British media are extremely well informed. I mean, and this reflects the truth about Britain, which is less true about Germany, which is that Britain, simply because of our language, we have a world culture. Our media don't just belong to the UK, don't just write or publish for the UK. They write and publish for a much, much wider audience, including a German audience. And that links us up with international attitudes, developments, ideas, more, I suspect, but I don't know Germany very well, than is likely to be the case in Paris or here in Berlin, or in countries where the language, however wonderful literature and however wonderful it is in itself, is to some extent a limitation on your cultural spread. Now, looking at the British people, again, you've got the vast majority of the British people, as you have the vast majority of any people, who aren't very interested in abroad other than as a place to go and get a holiday where you can get a suntan. And, you know, as you said, instinctively, abroad, to the extent it impinges on them, is the other, and to be suspected. But again, I think you need to distinguish them from not all the British elite. The British elite is riven and has its own loonies, of course. But if you look for the centre of gravity of sensible British active political and economic opinion, you're looking at people who see the UK, for example, as intrinsically part of Europe, who don't want the UK and the euro, but do want the euro to survive, who want Europe increasingly to function unitedly for foreign policy purposes, who sees the UK's natural place in the world as operating as part of a European phalanx in whatever issues we're dealing with. So in that sense, I think, as I say, not true of the great majority of the British people. There are deep Eurosceptics at the political level as well in the UK, but the centre of gravity, I would say, is roughly where it ought to be, which is very conscious of the limitations on the European project, but in general supportive of it for the good things that it brings to the UK.
So would you say that for the large majority of the people you're talking about, that Europe is, as Nick put it, no longer over there, that people view themselves now as Europeans?
Well, it is, of course, over there. I mean, we do play football against them, and they have continental systems of law and all of that. Mm-hmm. But even though it's over there, there's enough of a shared interest with it for us to be able to work together and to want to work together and to need to work together.
I find it, for myself, because I do, I speak to lots of people on a daily basis who come from the UK, either as media representatives or whatever, private citizens. It is amazing how in the last 10, 15 years, the perspective has changed from people from the UK looking at Europe like that and arriving in Europe and identifying with the European narrative, with the European stories, and wanting to find out more about it, and thinking that that is also in part their own narrative. I think there has been a tendency 20 years ago, people would have viewed the Europe that was the place where the wars were fought and where the ideologies clashed. That was not the same place as the island, which was the UK or Britain. I can sense people nodding a wee little bit. Katrin, is for you the challenge to get young people and people in general in the UK to speak more German, if that were at all possible, because we just talked about the language, or to project Germany and German culture from the German cultural base through German people speaking English?
I think it's both. I really think it's both, because the DAD, the organization that I'm working for now, is promoting both. We are promoting German language and German literature abroad, so therefore we have programs all over the world that promote these subjects. But it's also important for us to promote what we have here in Germany, our culture, and most of all, I think also of what we can offer in terms of academia and excellence and transfer of knowledge. I think we have to use English as a vehicle to transport what we're actually doing here, and then generating the interest, hopefully, or sparking the curiosity. We're talking about the lack of curiosity, to make people curious to see what is happening over there, what is happening on the other side when I stand in England and look over there, what is Europe, and hopefully see Germany. I think it has to go both ways. I mean, the task of promoting German language is a really difficult and thorny one right now, because we were talking about it before. Most of the Germans here prefer speaking English over speaking German to a foreign student to begin with, and then when Germans are abroad, they naturally stick to English or practice their English, as most of them call it. But I do think, and we were talking about that also, that language is a big part of the culture, so it is important to keep it up and keep supporting it as well. However, it will be more and more difficult, particularly with certain political decisions in Great Britain concerning German departments. I mean, how much more can the DAD do? Can we fully finance German departments in the future? Will we have to fully finance German departments because the own government can't do that anymore? I have the same problem in Iceland right now, thinking about, do I want to close the lecturer position that we have there? In Finland, one is right on the edge. I mean, it's not only in Great Britain, but it is certainly one important mission of the DAD to promote language. We will just have to figure out a way how we will deal in the future, and I'm going to span across Western Europe and Northern Europe in that area. The other half, promoting German culture through the English language, is much easier in my view. And I think it's as important, because you can't do one without the other. I mean, you can only generate interest by approaching the target group in the native language, or in English for that matter, and then hopefully from there generate further interest also back into the language. I don't think it works the other way anymore, and I think we've realized that also. But we still keep on working on the language part as well.
Thank you for that. Gerhard, we talked about the way that perhaps what you then went on to describe as what the Germans would call die soziale Marktwirtschaft, the social market economy, is like an export model that maybe the Brits could look to and perhaps adopt or adapt in some way. One of the cornerstone of German society is that this society is built on an understanding that compromise, consensus, and coalitions, these are very, very important things in Germany. That's very relevant in Britain at the moment, because we now have a coalition government in the UK, and people are beginning to debate much more broadly about the way in which perhaps an antagonistic social model with one side against the other and swapping backwards and forwards between the two, which is the traditional British model, is better or worse than the consensus model, especially in Germany. It's a very interesting debate, I think.
It is, and I think we're all eagerly watching for May 5, when the referendum will take place on whether Britain will change its voting system for the general election. And we don't know. I mean, the bookies don't know who's going to win, so we don't know either. That would, of course, increase the likelihood of coalition governments, and that would need the consensus requirement would be built in, or would be less unusual in British politics, and that might change a few things indeed. Having said this, one of the things which I really found remarkable about the British coalition government is that the country which hadn't done it seriously for 80 years and which had done it in a war situation during the Second World War for the last time, how seamlessly the whole thing just fell into place. I mean, the Liberal Democrats suffered very badly in the opinion polls through it, whatever, but they had a coalition agreement hammered out very, very, very soon. It seemed like they had been waiting for this to happen. And, I've seen single party governments in the UK which have worked worse. It seems that after all, the British politics and society can work with this type of a consensus model, certainly on that occasion. Whether that lasts the whole 5 years and how well it lasts, I mean, that we have problems there, but we've always had problems in German coalition governments as well. I had the impression anyway, I said it this morning, that the British coalition government, when it started, was working better than the German coalition government, which had been in place, elected half a year earlier, but still hadn't got their act together. So whether this also means you have consensus sort of society and cooperation and coalition on the economic level, I'm not quite sure. I don't see, well, the Germans would say that their Mitbestimmung is an exportable item, the way that labor unions are represented, workforce representatives in large enterprises are involved in decision-making in a double-tier structure. There's a supervisory board and half of the members are workforce. I see no UK party subscribing to that. And this is simply not going to happen.
That is remarkable in itself at this point in time, given that we don't know how tenuous the current German success is. It might be successful in the medium, it might be successful in the long term, but certainly it would be a model that would be worthy of considerable consideration at this point in time.
This is actually a funny thing. If you look at the wider perspective and include the Scandinavian countries or the Nordic countries, to say, they seem to be doing well, 60s, 70s, whatever. And then came the sort of the market society decade or so, where Britain was booming, really booming. I remember Britain is overtaking Italy on gross domestic product per capita. That was news. I mean, today you would really be surprised if the opposite ever happened. In all that boom, it looked like the social consensus, social cohesion, social market society model was going to fail. And then it bounced back in Sweden, in Finland, in Norway. And if you look at the OECD figures, the marks they give on how competitive the economies are, they've done away with some of that totalitarian almost control of state over all kinds of things, but they've kept the social net in there. And if German society was perhaps a little less sort of reluctant to any sort of change, it could be a little faster in adopting to the Scandinavian way of doing things. But it seems that this has survived the economic crisis rather well. And possibly, arguably, in Sweden better than in Germany. But yes, at the moment it looks like a success story. I was proven wrong. I thought it would happen as always. Britain dips into the recession like that, and Germany slides gradually into it. And Britain gets out like that, and Germany very gradually, eventually, whatever. It didn't work out this time. It made me wonder.
We're talking about different perceptions, Nick, in the media between Germany and the UK, and sometimes we're talking about that there is sometimes a rabid element on the British media side. We're seeing it being downplayed, advisedly so. What's the situation on the German side? I can remember the correspondent for Die Zeit in London, Thomas Kielinger, who's a very well-respected commentator from sort of centre-right position and a very sort of acute observer of things British and things German. I remember him not too long ago saying there's a problem on the German side that the German media don't really succeed in developing a gripping narrative about Germany as a society. Does that sound like a good and relevant observation from your point of view as somebody who knows both countries, knows the German media as well?
There's a very good, I don't know if you watch the TED channel, if any of you know that, where they have good public debates. You'll find it on YouTube. And there's a very good speech called the Tyranny of the Single Narrative, if you look that up. It's a very, very good speech about how different cultures or different societies hone in on one particular type of narrative about a people or culture and forget the others. So I really recommend you watching that. As for the German narrative, I think one thing which hasn't been mentioned now, and it's particularly in the last couple of years, is we've gone talking about the Second World War. We've gone talking about the British perception of Europe. The recent German narrative in the light of the financial crisis is going to be very, very interesting, because we said, since 2006, Germans view themselves differently and other people view Germans differently. Well, ich habe meine Bedenken, no? Because we've already seen this in Greece a little bit. What happens if Germany becomes too good? It's developing really a position where it becomes the paymaster and the banker of last resort for quite a few Mediterranean countries, who will then have no opportunity to devalue or to pursue economic policies. I've got some Irish friends, and they don't talk about, it's the ECB coming here. They say the Germans are in Dublin. They're telling us what to do now. Now, the Irish have had far worse conquerors than the Germans before. We should know, but I'm a little bit worried about how Germany is perceived and how Germans then perceive Germany. If Germany becomes the kind of, how can I put this, the schoolmaster, strict and stern for Greece, Portugal, Spain, and maybe Italy, maybe Belgium as well. This could dramatically, and I'm talking in the next few months even, dramatically change the way we view Germany. And I think you've seen a little bit already in the media in Germany about on the one hand there's a fear to the traditional German fear after the war to be too aggressive about this. But at the same time, I have to be honest, I've seen a lot of things about, and in quite serious newspapers, the FAZ and the Rundschau, the lazy Greeks have to work as long as Germans do. They can't sit in the sun and enjoy an early retirement while we are going in our factories punctual to work every day in order to pay for this. And there are some comments coming out which are a little bit an die Grenze, I would say. So, I mean, the new narrative for Germany is, it's strong. We've got the war behind us. It's a new generation. We've discovered postmodern irony as well as the New Yorkers have. But I'm a little bit concerned here that Germany is falling into a trap where it now feels that it has to be the enforcer of the European ideal. And I think this could become the new narrative. By mistake, by accident, but it's definitely a danger there.
Okay, we're going to open up the debate in just a second so that other people can surely ask questions, but I'd just like to ask one more. We talked a little bit, this is one aspect of the way Germany's projecting itself at the moment in the economic field. Another way that's very, very relevant at the moment, and I think where the media debate is also very important, is the story we've had around the huge upheaval in the Arab world and the recent developments in Libya. And so Tony mentioned this, and I would just like to come back to him on that and get him to comment a little bit more, because I think there is a difference in the media approach to international affairs, to interventions in international hotspots and what have you, that certainly in the British media there's a far greater assumption, and I think in British life in general, that life is made up of, that there's intuitively a right and a wrong. And I think in Germany there is much more relativism in the media too, which is then viewed from the British side sometimes as moral prevarication. And very often the German media are playing to the greater German public, who, because of the German history that we've heard about, there is a subcurrent, a very strong current of pacifism here in Germany, and that the media are often playing to the fact that people in general in Germany, although it is changing, view war as not only a last resort, but as something that simply shouldn't happen. This has led to the whole crisis around Libya and the German position being different from many other members of the international community, the Western international community. And I'd just like to hear what Sir Tony has to say about all that again.
Gosh. Well, I'm going to evade questions of right and wrong, but I think there is really quite a profound difference between the UK and Germany here, and it lies in our history, fundamentally. I mean, the UK is an ex-imperial power, has not recently lost a war, has the mentality of a country which I tend to think of the world as a smaller and smaller village, where there are far too many hoodlums living down the bad end, and you need a few of the village elders to step in from time to time to sort them out. And there are actually very few elders who are willing to go out there and do the sorting out down the bad end of the village. And the UK has consistently thought of itself as being one of them. And you go back a long way. You go back to Kosovo, you go through Iraq, of course, you go through Afghanistan. And the UK is less squeamish about the use of military force, if necessary, to sort out international problems. So when Libya came along, for example, I mean, there's lots of hesitation, there's lots of memories of Iraq, there's lots of, we're still in Afghanistan, aren't our forces overstretched, and all of that. But and all of which are entirely valid questions. But nevertheless, there is a feeling that if someone's going to go out there and deal with this mess in effect on our borders, then we have to be there with them. And the presumption that the US can do it all on their own, to the extent it was ever true, it certainly isn't true now, both in terms of US willingness and in terms of US capacity. So all of British history is about us being in the forefront of dealing with international problems as and when they arise. And that was one of the pleasures of working for the British Foreign Office, because you were constantly doing things. Looking back, they may have been bad things or good things, but they were things. In Germany, by contrast, now it's not for me to talk in any depth about Germany, but my feeling is that the Second World War is important here. That was a turning point. That was the terminus ad quem for a deeply militaristic, interventionist, very, very nasty style of government. And Germany, partly through its own self-reconstruction, and partly through the Allied occupation and the systems which were imposed on Germany from outside, came out with a much more pacifist, a much more non-interventionist, a much more cautious approach to how you deal with international problems. And for a long time, I was reminded of this. I went for a walk this afternoon, and I wound up at Checkpoint Charlie and the wall and all of that. And it's a sharp reminder that, of course, Germany has only been a unified country for the last, I'm going to get this wrong, 21 years or something. Germany wasn't even complete. It was totally dependent upon external military force to play whatever role it was able to play in international affairs at all. So Germany has been much less militaristic, much less interventionist, as I say, much more inward-looking in terms of its attitude to external problems than the UK has been. And that difference of approach, difference of history, has shown up regularly and is currently showing up over Libya, where there was real shock. I mean, this may sound like trivia, but it's really quite revealing. You will all recall UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which is the one which has permitted the current intervention which is going on in Libya. I dealt quite a lot with the UN over my career. And even if you disagree with the UN Security Council resolution, if you are on the side of what is about to be done, then you don't abstain, you vote for it and explain very publicly, in particular to your own public, why you are not going to be involved in the subsequent operation. And it was a very, very unnecessarily wide disavowal by Germany of what the UK and France and indeed America and a lot of other people, Italy, are now engaged in, to actually abstain on this deeply symbolic resolution. And it'll pass. Everybody will forget it, of course. But the underlying reality which it demonstrates, which is that Germany is not yet ready to play the role which I frankly think it ought to be playing, as one of the village elders quelling the hoodlums, remains a reality.
Thank you. Should we take questions from anybody who wants to have a go? Come on, don't be so shy.
While there's this pause for questions, I could abuse my position here. I'm not convinced 100%, Tony, by this argument. Very quickly. I think upon reflection, I'm not going to quibble about Gaddafi being a hoodlum or not. I think it's pretty clear what he is. But one could say over the last couple of weeks, maybe some people are thinking we should have maybe held on here and we shouldn't have gone marching in, or bombing. I mean, I think the beginning was it was clear, and now people are saying, well, maybe. And secondly, just quickly add, I absolutely agree about the Second World War, but I think one thing Brits always forget is, I think one of the important things for Germany is not just the whole Nazi issue, is British people often forget that apart from the Channel Islands, we weren't invaded. So we did suffer. Surely we suffered, particularly in the industrial centres. We were bombed and many people got killed. But I think a country like Germany, where it was total humiliation, and millions of people from the east came over, and there was Vertreibung and rape as a weapon of war. You perceive war in a different way than Britain, who we won, and we never really suffered much as certain countries did. Anyway, that's enough of me talking.
Questions?
Shall I introduce myself again? Hello, my name is Sebastian. I'm from Germany. I would like to ask a question towards the perception of Angela Merkel in UK. If you read some international press like New York Times or Herald Tribune, it seems like the perception of our Chancellor is is a little bit bad. It seems like she's described as behaving or forcing German views upon other EU members, especially regarding into the topic of the financial crisis. So I would like to know if the perception in UK is really like our Chancellor is forcing German views upon EU members.
I'll just start the conversation off. I think that's wrong. I think Angela Merkel is exactly the sort of woman whom a certain type of middle-class Englishman loves. And she's a tough schoolmistress, you know. She's bringing discipline. And I think that I can't comment for the vast majority of English, but I think in the British decision-making, the political classes, the discipline she is bringing is endorsed and is found persuasive.
Yeah, I think you're right. Personally, I felt that until recently, Frau Merkel had a quite stodgy image, particularly in the British media. German leaders don't seem to come across that well, I think, but they don't seem to. Maybe her English didn't come across that well, also in the British media. But as for having a tough nanny syndrome in Germany, I think the problem is not so much Angela Merkel. It's that, as I said before, in Germany now there is a lot of talk about strict discipline being needed, and I guess that's why some Germans here are attending. I think diplomacy, as Tony, as a practitioner of it, is a very fine art, and I think that some of the problems coming over now in Germany's political position could be solved not by changing the policy, but maybe a diplomatic softening. And I think it's very important that Germany and Frau Merkel doesn't come across as if it's a German solution for a Greek problem or a Portuguese problem, but it's a European solution that Germany is happy to contribute towards. Otherwise, a diplomatic problem can be a political problem later.
I'm Sebastian from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. First of all, I would like to agree, because I think that generally Angela Merkel and the German government is perceived much better in the UK than in Germany, particularly reading The Economist. However, I've got a different question. Looking at UK and Germany just now and the Liberals and how they do in the polls, would you think, or would you say there's a relation why both parties are doing so badly just now? Or do you think it's just a coincidence?
Both parties meaning the Liberal Democrats and which?
Liberal Democrats and FDP.
Well, yes, the Liberal Democrats are in the doldrums. They only poll 15%. Yeah, I think the FDP once managed to poll that. So there is quite a difference between the two, and they are very different parties. There have been lately the differences have not been as discernible as they used to, but that has to do with the coalition and the Cameron government. The Liberal Democrats have been losing a lot of supporters because they have disillusioned the left part of the party very clearly. On many issues, if you compare the election manifestos of 2010, but even more so of the previous election, the Liberal Democrats were left of Labour. Not left of old Labour, but certainly left of new Labour. And they were liberal in the political sense, not in the economic sense. And becoming a bedfellow of David Cameron is about the worst thing for many Liberal voters on the left side. So that I have been losing 7% from there is very, I think, obvious. They may have been gaining here and there too. Whether they bounce back or not, I'm not quite sure. If they can pull off the thing of switching the United Kingdom to the new voting system, I think people will come back. They would I'm not quite sure, but their strategy is to pick up the second and the third votes in the alternative voting system. They might or they might not succeed. If they lose the next election, I think they will probably bounce back again. But we don't know. This is prophecy. The German Freie Demokraten are a very different type of breed. They used to be the party of the political and market liberalism, but they changed very much they saw their niche in the market, because the Christian Democrats, as I've mentioned before, are deeply wedded to the idea of social market economy, and the Liberal Democrats saw their niche there, perhaps neglecting their political wing for a little bit. Guido Westerwelle and Nick Clegg, again, comparison is not that obvious. They're very, very different people, different personalities. So the trouble they're having, they both are having trouble, but of very different sort. And I think I would suspect that both bounce back. But again, the German Liberal Democrats would be very, very happy to bounce to a position which the Liberal Democrats in the UK have right now.
Hello, I'm Hayat from Sudan. My question is, why the media theory are still as if old like that, and the media is still playing the old role of it without taking in mind what is going on, and what is your European Union is now a union which takes all the European countries, and they have many strategies and plans in economy and some external affairs. But the media is still reserving its old role. If we see the British media, it is still imperialism, and as if it is in the history playing the same role of when it is colonial period, especially in the external affair like Iraqi or Libyan, or they take decision that they must make interventions and shape the public opinion that British must have some action for this. And when we find the same time the German media and the German government policy, external policy, plays the same role of the history also. They separate themselves from this affair. There is not the same plan or same theory for the media or same view or point in the external affair especially. We can find the American and British play separate role when other countries are not the same. And also, the media is very, very controlled in those countries, in the external affair, not in the internal affair. The media plays the same role of the external affairs role. Yeah. If the government want to do that, the media goes the same direction, and it is all the theories of the media is still controlling and dominating the media of the journalists or journalism now. We need some new theories which can take in mind what is going on. Now the world is changing, and Europe, which was in conflict in the past, now in unity, and other countries like which was under the colonialism or British control or other countries' control, now are independent, but it is still under their what I said. Yeah.
So your main point, as I understand it, is that both the British media and the German media are
playing the same role of the past.
Okay.
The history
They're clinging very close to their national traditions and national histories and traditions, but also remaining attending to toe too closely, perhaps the government's line as well.
Yeah, that's what my point.
I'm happy to comment. Yeah.
Well, I think it's very interesting what's happened with the whole WikiLeaks and everything to do with the internet recently over the last few years. I think this is a real challenge to the perception of media. I mean, you're absolutely right that a few years ago, media was getting more and more concentrated, and there was some serious questions being asked about how this affects the pursuit of not just foreign policy but any policy. But I see the developments. I know Julian Assange is not everybody's cup of tea, as we say, but I see some very positive developments where I think it will be very difficult for certain groups in the media to really set a narrative that nobody could disagree with. I mean, I say to my students sometimes, think about your grandparents. Even if your grandparents were quite successful, or unless they were very successful, they never really influenced that many people. Whereas every single person in this room is probably on Facebook and Wikipedia and is downloading this document and can discuss things with thousands, maybe millions of people around the world. Everybody here can affect other people around the world. And I think the change in the media landscape means that actually there is now competition in media.
Well, I had the pleasure of being in Khartoum a year ago, and I was just wondering what people in Darfur and in the south of Sudan would think about the Sudanese press. If I compare that to the British press and the German press, I think I see more variety there. I see everything. There are government supporting press. In Britain, you used to be able to tell which party somebody voted for by the newspaper they're reading. This is not entirely true. It probably never was entirely true. But yes, there are certain political affiliations, and you would expect certain papers to be generally more imposed towards the government or the opposition. Have you ever come across a journalist called Robert Fisk? I think you would probably agree with much what he says. But isn't he living proof of the fact that there are very critical voices writing, for instance, for The Independent about Britain's repeating its colonial past, one of your points. That's a way of seeing it. I'm not sure whether the people in Benghazi would agree at the moment. But yes, I know I have friends from Algeria or whatever who are now being very critical about exactly the same point. The colonial powers invading again. But I think even within the Arabic world, there are different views about that. There are people who loathe Gaddafi and who are afraid that very serious things might happen if Gaddafi was to take over Benghazi. So I think it's more varied. I mean, you really couldn't say about either the British or the German media that they're state-controlled and that you don't get the variety. They have to look at their customers who buy the papers. So yes, certain stories run better than others. That is certainly true. But you do get quite a variety, and you certainly get critical voices in both countries. Actually, critique of government tends to sell quite well.
Yeah, well, that was the point I was going to make, really. I mean, having worked inside government, my instinctive reaction, and he would say this, wouldn't he, is that an abiding fault of at least the British media is that they are instinctively anti-official policy. The way you earn your spurs as a journalist is by uncovering an official scandal and preferably bringing a minister down, which is fine. I mean, ministers adapt themselves to this very hostile environment. But it does mean that policy making takes place in a much more cautious, hedged way than it would if you could rely on a much more supportive media than we have in the UK. And let me go on from that. I mean, as I think about the British media in the current context, in the European context, I think you can justly criticise the British media for not taking Europe seriously enough, not giving it enough coverage, and on the whole taking a pretty sceptical approach to European initiatives, partly because that's the same approach as they bring to British government initiatives. But I think it is also fair to say that the British media has got one thing right, which a lot of the continental media has not got right, which is that an awful lot of more interesting and important things are going on in the world than intra-European squabbles. You've got China emerging, you've got Russia re-emerging, you've got India emerging. You've got a very seriously changing world out there, which Europe, without doubt, has failed to respond to adequately, and has failed to respond to adequately because a lot of the European political culture is about Europeans arguing with each other. And that is partly a political fault, but it's partly a media fault as well.
Hi, I'm Kat and I'm from England. I'd like to raise the idea / issue of Anglo-German stereotypes in the media, specifically the UK media. When I think of perceptions of the UK and Germany, I have to admit, and I think a lot of British people would also admit, that they think of BBC sitcoms such as Hello, Hello, 40 Towers and Dad's Army, all folk.
Yes, and many others.
I'm sorry to all German people that wouldn't understand them, but basically they're all terrible comedies from maybe the 70s. I'm not sure, quite a few years back. They all have stereotypes of German people, which are possibly quite negative. And I'd like to raise the idea that perhaps arguably UK-German relations are going quite well at the moment, but the thing that's holding us back is a British issue, and that is one of that we can't quite get over our stereotypes of Germans, and specifically that we sort of have a broken record. We're stuck between don't mention the war and making terrible, awkward jokes about it. And so, yeah, I'd like to ask what your thoughts are about this, perhaps. The Germans amongst you, if there are any negative English stereotypes. The only program I know of is Dinner for One. And do you think that only time will aid this, or are there other ways? Maybe perhaps the media should be censored, so that I thought of an example that I'd like to raise is that
let's take the first question.
I just wanted to say that there was an article in the Daily Mail recently about a house that looks like Hitler, and I just think it's getting a bit pathetic now, and I was wondering what your viewpoints were.
I'm happy to answer, but Katrin, go on.
Yeah, you want to go?
I've got so much to say about that.
I'm actually I'm quite happy that these exist, and I'm quite happy that they're here to entertain us also. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, that's not even a British production, that's Austin Powers. That's a Canadian, Mike Myers playing the British agent, and we have all this fascination with the Brits as being agents, and they have all these gadgets, and drive these cars and drink martinis and whatnot. I don't. Yeah, I'm not so sure if the media if that should be censored, or if it shouldn't be there. If anything, it entices you to maybe think about it a little further. I mean, I like to use these examples in my classroom. I like to play with these overly exaggerated stereotypes and then just break them down and look precisely at what creates the other, and is it actually ourselves that is creating the other, but it is us in the end. So no, censorship definitely not, and I think we need them also. I think we need it to open up to one another. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, and you probably go in a completely different direction, but to me it's going back to generating interest, and even these images and these stereotypes create interest at a certain level, to a certain extent. I might be, I might work on a too low pop culture level, but I really enjoy using that, particularly in cultural studies classes, in creating narratives and creating counter narratives and creating artificial narratives about otherness.
I have to say something because I feel passionate about Fawlty Towers. I think it's one of the best shows I've seen, really. John Cleese's Basil Fawlty. I think this is such a classic. The one thing I've never understood is how people could understand this as being anti-German or anti-American or anti-psychology. Because this is a recurrent pattern. Basil Fawlty, the little Englander with his own little problem, and his wife, and then all these sorts of things which are hanging him down, he gets constantly irritated by things which don't fit into his little Englandhood. And this could be Germans. He has German guests. He is in this don't mention the war attitude because he's all constantly thinking don't mention the war. He's mentioning it all the time, of course. There's the psychologist who comes. And, of course, all the time he's afraid that he might be analyzed while he's serving dinner, and therefore he starts blurting out things and everything seeing in a sexual context which isn't there, which very often is there with Basil Fawlty on other occasions, but not on that occasion. And the same about the Americans. This love-hate relationship I mentioned before is coming out. Fawlty Towers is making fun of English people, of little Englanders. It's true, however, that about half the British population believes it's making fun of Germans. That's true. I find that slightly worrying. Why? Why is that the case? And I just may add one other occasion. we're just wondering how much good we're doing in cultural exchanges. We had, while I was at the University of Oxford, at the law faculty, we had exchanges with 4 German universities going on a very slim base of British students who spoke enough German, but we're sending about 12 a year, which is not bad at all. And I was once invited for a reunion they had organized. They got money from a law firm to deal with that. They were paying a nice dinner, and they're inviting their tutors to come to the dinners. There I was. And there was the first after-dinner speech by somebody who had returned from the program, and he was starting with 2 things. 5-1, we got even on the football reference here, and don't mention the war. And I just couldn't believe it. This chap had been to Germany for 1 year, and that's all he could think of. All he'd been there just wondering, well, is this really useful? Is it all in vain? But, after a couple of drinks, we got along better again. So Fawlty Towers, yes, but don't blame it on the BBC. I think it's just, perhaps, if anything, blame it on the audience.
Further questions or further comments? Nick?
Yeah, just a very quick comment. I think the problem for Germans, it makes them extremely vulnerable to being upset by the British, is I've never met any culture which is more Anglophile than the Germans. I live in Frankfurt and I attend Burns Night. I was amazed to find full hour-long coverage of Last Night of the Proms on German TV, and then all the royal family, and I've been to places in Germany where they insist on drinking tea the right way and having muffins and the rest of it. And I've actually had conversations, maybe it's just the Germans I know, but I've had conversations with Germans and they say, a little quietly behind their hand, wir sind die bessere Engländer. Yeah. And I think that's what really upsets Germans, that when all of a sudden after 70 years we still come out with something about the Second World War, they say, well, Germans they're Anglophiles, they like Britain and like England, and I think this makes it even more sort of upsetting for them somehow. If it was the French, they wouldn't mind so much, maybe. Sorry.
Okay, I'm Ingmar from Germany. I am much in favor of any stereotypes because it just gives a really perfect introduction to any conversation. So that's not really the issue. I have 2 questions. The first one is the Financial Times labeled Germany as the reluctant superpower of Europe in this sense, and they were actually referring back to the pre-World War I world in which Germany was becoming stronger and stronger and was still not sure whether it should be assertive or not, and they were comparing it to the current situation. And my question would be, on the one hand, Germany is pretty insecure on whether to be assertive economically towards Europe's south, but on the other hand, also Germany is criticized for not getting involved militarily in for instance, Libya. And I think Germany is just really insecure. So my question would be, what role could Germany really play in Europe? Can it actually be the assertive power, or should it actually disguise its strength? And the second question isn't related to it, but I've read an article in The Guardian regarding the Kashmir conflict and David Cameron being in I think it was in India, and he was actually apologizing for the colonial past of Britain. And I was wondering, what role does the colonial past play in British society? Is there a debate? And in the British media? Thanks.
Wow. No, first of all, let's take the first question first. Gerhard, let's just talk a little bit about what role should Germany play? How should Germany define itself, project itself?
Well, that's a difficult one. I mean, we have the Goethe Institute, we have DAAD, we have all this foreign cultural policy, and the German government has been trying hard not to be governmental about it. The German government has been financing these institutions, but putting less, a longer leash on them than would be on the British Council. And I think by and large it's not a bad policy. So we have seen a lot of, I've just been critical about the possible consequences of even a year-long exchange, but by and large I think they have done good. I don't think whether so much more needs really to be done or could be done usefully from the German side. Having said before that, by and large, I mean, I mentioned the jingoism, but I also mentioned that this is not specifically directed against Germans at all. Yes, we've had the obsession with Nazi Germany and the Second World War. I just don't see another Goethe representative or another DAD lector. I mean, there how many are there? 70 or something like that? 60 German Lektoren in
33.
33. We're going down, but it used to be in the heydays. It used to be 65 or something.
It's like around 50.
Yeah. But still, the German government is paying through the DAD 35 university lecturers who are there. So I think a lot is being done, and given that by and large, I think there is a healthy relationship. I just don't think there is a great need to put up this extra effort. I mean, I would, of course, argue against any more slimming down. But by and large, I think, yes.
Okay, I would just like to go back to pick up on that question. One thing that I think has just been slightly lacking in the debate, which I think is coming up. This is something I'd like to map out, something that you were referring to about Germany's image in Europe, or how Germany projects itself. You were talking about Angela Merkel being perhaps the schoolmistress, the strict schoolmistress of Europe. I think what's going to happen in the very near future in Europe is that we're going to see in the middle of the summer of 2013, we're going to see in Europe the European Stability Mechanism come into place for the Eurozone countries. And this is a really, really tightly welded, and this is not a cliche, this is a straitjacket for economic behavior for the Eurozone member countries. And I think what it's going to mean is that those countries are going to be knit much more closely together in uniform structures than ever before. And I think what it's going to mean is that the countries outside those structures are going to find themselves more excluded than ever before. And I think that's going to be a position that Britain finds itself in. And I'm not sure that the British people are aware of that. I'm not sure that the press is informing people that that's what's happening. And this is very much Germany in a stealth kind of a way, imposing its vision on Europe.
If I may. Yeah, there are a lot of things I could... Very good questions, firstly. I think on Germany, stealthily or not, exercising more influence in Europe, I think that would be entirely welcome to the UK, actually. I think it has been Germany's passivity over a lot of the history of the European Union, which has been part of the background to a lot of the European Union's problems. The misuse of money, the generally rather flabby way that the European Union operates, needs, if I can put it this way, German discipline. And the fact that Germany is now bestirring itself to do a bit more, admittedly for domestic financial concerns and political concerns, but nevertheless I think that will bring benefits to the European Union. I have to say I'm slightly sceptical about the European Stability Pact straitjacket. We've seen European straitjackets before, and Houdini-like, Europe seems consistently to slip out of them. But a bit more Germanic discipline, I think, would be entirely welcome to the UK and would be entirely good for Europe. Your question about the impact of our colonial past on our attitude to and behaviour in the world now is really a fascinating question. There is no doubt in my mind, the UK it's been quite an interesting process going on in the UK over, I guess, the last 5 or 10 years, that there's been something of a reconsideration of how good was empire. Up until then, there was a traditional sort of left-wing narrative, is the word you guys use, isn't it? Which was that we were evil, colonialist oppressors, and the countries which we ran so badly were extremely well rid of us. And the reconsideration over the last 10 years has amounted to pointing out that actually we built a lot of the roads, we built a lot of the railways, we installed rule of law, we installed a lot of rather good government. It didn't last everywhere, but it did last in a number of places, most conspicuously India, which remains a democracy against all the odds, 60 years or whatever it is after we gave them independence. And there's much more confidence in the British ruling elite, if I can put it that way, that we shouldn't be wandering around the world apologising for empire, that we should take a bit more pride and self-confidence from some of the things which we genuinely, constructively did when we were running all of these places. Now, how that plays into current foreign policy is actually very difficult, because if you go to the Indians, and this is a mistake that various British foreign ministers have made, and say, we used to run you, and therefore we can tell you how to solve the Kashmir problem, you will inevitably get a very loud raspberry. And a succession of British foreign ministers have had precisely that experience. And that was a bit of the background, I think, to Cameron's apology I think it was in Pakistan a couple of weeks ago. On the other hand, as a result of empire, we have links and institutions out there which are usable for good purposes. It was the UK which more or less single-handedly brought to the end a very, very nasty insurrection going on in Sierra Leone. Not a country we would naturally have anything to do with, but because it was a previous British possession. We felt a moral obligation, and we did, I have no doubt in my mind, an extremely good and worthwhile job in dealing with the issues that were there. Through the Commonwealth, we are able to bring pressure on places like Fiji, which have rather unpleasant regimes, and help to make those regimes significantly less repressive. So at the margins, the colonial experience can be directly useful. At the core of foreign policy, you need to handle it very carefully, because you've got a rather resentful peoples around who still look back on the British rule as a time when they were wrongly oppressed. So the important impact there is that it does give the UK, I think, a worldwide role, a worldwide perception of what it knows about and what it can do, which encourages us to come back to something I was saying earlier, to be active on issues worldwide.
Could I ask you something in that context about your work in Russia as the ambassador and your profound knowledge of Russia? Because certainly the British approach to Russia has been very much has been a very critical approach towards the Russian authorities, and animated very much by the sense of there is right and there is wrong. And the German approach has been very much more to prevaricate in the way that we've talked about a little bit, and to keep lines of communication open. Do you regret that the Brits have moved into a position of conflict with the Russians and the Russians with the Brits, that it's come to the pass that it is at this point in time?
I mean, we can go into this in more depth tomorrow. I mean, we have a strong tradition of our foreign policy reflecting our values including concern for human rights. And I mean, it was much less black and white than maybe you've gained the impression. We also have a lot of huge economic interests in Russia, and in my time as ambassador and before and since, British policy towards Russia was a matter of balancing material interest, and not only material interest, our capacity to cooperate with the Russians on issues like Iran, on issues like North Korea and so on, our capacity to deal with those big issues with the Russians, while at the same time, when a minister is asked, what do you think about the fact that Khodorkovsky's been sent off to jail for another 14 years, he tends to reply straight off, well, that's a terrible, terrible thing. And that sort of balance is something where we have lent more in the speaking up for human rights direction than the German authorities have been able to do. And you could say various cruel things about why the Germans have been in the position they've been in. I mean, a third of Germans' gas comes from Russia, so it would on the whole be a big mistake to alienate them totally. Germany has a much bigger trade balance with Russia than we do, so you can see the material pressures on this, and I do hope we can get back into this. So this is preparation for you for all tomorrow to ask some hard questions. My instinct is that if the Germans had been willing to speak up more loudly, along with us, the French and others, that would have shifted, that would have helped to produce a slightly more liberal Russia than the one we've actually got.
There's another question.
So I'm going to ask a question that maybe brings it back to the original debate. I've noticed quite a lot of the discussion is focused on UK perceptions of Germany in the media. And I wanted to kind of focus on something that Katrin said about Germans as in recent years have perhaps become a bit more comfortable with being German. And is it perhaps the reverse in England? You know, there's a lot of debate and discussion about what is it to be British nowadays. When I talk to German students, everyone wants to go to America. You know, Britain's not even on the agenda. So has Britain perhaps lost some of its charm?
Well, maybe it's just my friends that I know, but I like to think we still have our charm. I think, I mean, America's obviously, I think, for all Europeans and many sort of thrusting young graduates, American universities are seen as the elite. But I would question the idea that, you know, because I still think that LSE, Oxford and Cambridge belong to the elite of Europe. So I think a lot of not just German students but European students, they want to go to spend at least a year in Britain, or want to go and spend a year as an intern at a bank in London or something similar like that. But what you mentioned earlier about lack of confidence, I think there is an issue, and I know I don't want to cover something which is going to be covered later on, but around the whole thing with devolution. And I know that English people, we like to present this sort of blasé image that it hasn't really affected us, but I think it has. And I think that if we do go down this road of Scotland and Wales being sort of chipped off slowly, it will affect the way we view ourselves, because at the moment we see ourselves as this big island, but if England becomes sort of a part of an island and become a much smaller country, then obviously we sort of go down the pecking order. And, combine that with Germany unifying a few years back and now having a bigger population, I think there is a perception maybe in Britain, combined with the recession, that we're not quite as powerful as we used to be. And, mentioning what Tony said earlier about sort of Britain punching above its weight, human rights, the legacy of empire, as we move away from that and we become just a middle-ranking European country, I think there may be a problem with the way we perceive ourselves. My argument would be that we should, Brits or as English people, we should then strive to get a new narrative. I'm sorry, but and I think there's plenty of stuff there in our history that we can get a new narrative. We don't need to concentrate so much on the empire for this. So I'm not sure if I've answered you really how you wanted, but I would say that educationally, as an experience, I think England and Britain are still up there for young Europeans. But I do agree with you that I think there is a subtle change of perception. Scots now think of themselves as Scots first and foremost, and Brits a long way down. And this will inevitably impact on how powerful Britain is and how English people perceive themselves.
Hi, my name's Jamie. I'm from London. I was just wondering how you feel that... I think we've established that Britain, the majority of Brits are fine with the UK dealing with Germany, but how you would feel when, how you think that the Jewish people feel who live in United Kingdom, because I think there is quite a large majority of Jewish people in the UK. I think they still probably have an issue with it. I myself aren't Jewish, but I have family kind of who are. And I think because there is reminders, as we've discussed, but kind of in films and documentaries and education, I'm just wondering how you feel, how you think they think about the issue and how Germany should deal with it, because that maybe their relations with Israel, like we've already discussed, or they're quite good, but I think the feeling is Jewish people might still have a problem, but I'm not sure.
Can I just, before you do a personal anecdote, because I have been living in Germany for, as you said, Nick, more than 2 decades, and I have in that time, I've established a sort of a very, a full life here, in the fullest sense, culturally as well. And a few years ago, it's quite a while now, 6 years ago, I took on German citizenship and became dual citizenship, which was very apt, because that's where I am. I'm halfway between the two cultures. And it was very interesting, because if I'd done that 15 or 20 years ago, it wasn't a possibility at the time. Well, it would have been possible, but through the European Union, it has now become a very natural step. If I'd done that 20 years ago, I think an awful lot of people would have been, quite frankly, shocked. And it was very interesting to stroll up to or stroll into a situation and say, by the way, I am now also a German. And people were very relaxed about that, with one exception. I thought it was very interesting. An English Jewish friend of mine, who's a very enlightened fellow, when I told him that I had taken German citizenship, he simply said to me, that is not something that one does. You don't elect to become a German. No.
And I have the other example, precisely a very good friend of mine who is Jewish and who's very active in his Jewish life. He just became German again. He reinstated his German citizenship because he felt that was part of his heritage. And the experiences that I have made are very twofold, I must say. And New York is maybe a very different area, a different pflaster, as we would say. You have the generation that actually, the last survivors of the Holocaust, that are fine with being German and they see themselves as German. I have plenty of old ladies coming. They still to this day say, I would like to be buried in Germany because that is my home country and I would like to go back. Whereas the second and third generation have a lot more issues with Germany as having this particular past. But I also think I agree with you. I think it's changing. It has been changing for the past 15 years. I mean, clearly, if you go to the German consulate in New York, one of the main missions is to keep up the dialogue, keep open the dialogue with the Jewish community, which is particularly strong in New York. But it's also it's all different kinds of people within that community, and they're not all united in that one community. So I think it really depends on where you move and which circles you're dealing with. It's certainly I think you have to be sensible and sensitive in a certain way, but it's not by definition anymore a bad thing to be a German or to take on German citizenship or to decide to become a German. I think you just have to still use a little bit more than common sense to walk that line. But it's clearly not. I don't think we have to be as. I think Germans were overly. It might sound weird the way I say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. Germans were overly cautious, but in the wrong direction, because they weren't making it better. They weren't making the dialogue better necessarily. And I think they've come to find or figuring out a way or trying to approach a way of seeing it as part of a normal part of life, and really, facing the past in a different way than they have before. It's not only apologetic anymore. It's really trying to understand and opening a dialogue, and I think that is the key difference and a big difference. And I would hope that for the United Kingdom as well.
Yes, I can add another anecdotal, maybe turning it empirical, by the second one of a colleague and friend of mine who retook German citizenship with one generation gap in between, and she's Jewish. Many of my friends and colleagues in Oxford are. I mean, I don't even think about it, but now that you've brought up the question, I started counting, and they're no less open-minded, certainly not. And I never felt that they treated me differently from a French colleague or Italian or whatever on the grounds of German nationality. The generation before might have been different. That's on both sides. I would expect this to be different, but I don't think that's an obstacle. UK has a very large Jewish community, and you didn't even talk about them being integrated. I think they are integrated. I mean, it's not an issue, and I think the treatment of how Germans are being viewed is not. The Jewish community would not think very different from the Catholic community, and the Catholic not very different from the Anglican community. I would think that's the religion is not really an issue in there, which is a good thing. Yeah.
Very quick comment. The country with the fastest growing Jewish population in the world is Germany. It's not Israel or America. So I think, without wishing to speak for the world's population of Jews, I think if it's good enough for Jewish people, I think it should be good enough for somebody who's half Yorkshire, half Scots.
It was very interesting because in my own case, the friend in question who was rather shocked by me picking up my certificate of nationality here in Germany. I have had long discussions with him, and some of these discussions have actually been in the media about this whole notion of broadening the envelope, because it has the whole notion of what Germanness is has changed dramatically in the last 20 years, very, very much for the best. And I argued that my friend Simon, he's in a very similar position to myself. In his case, he has a German wife and a German daughter, and I'm saying to him, Simon, if you become a German citizen as well as being a British citizen, you are broadening the envelope, and that's very much part of the process that's happened here in Germany in the last 20 years. I thought it was very interesting. We've mentioned soccer a couple of times this evening. Just a week or so ago, when Real Madrid played against Barcelona in Spain, it was actually transmitted live on German TV in the evening, and there's this huge tradition of German players having played for both of these clubs, all sorts of people with very German names like Uli Stielicke and what have you. And the reason why it was transmitted on German television was not just natural interest in the match itself, but because Mesut Özil and Sami Khedira were playing for Real Madrid, two Germans, and this was fantastic. This was 20 years ago, inconceivable in Germany that it would have come to this, and it's a very dramatic development. Germany was very stuck in the mud on these issues, to put it very sort of mildly. Yeah. Shall we make this the last question? I would propose.
Hello.
I don't know where Mark is.
How can we make the media defer it away from the history? Because now the new generation at being under the history without having any effect. Germany now, everyone justifies them for the Holocaust, and the British for colonialism, and other countries for slavery and some, and we are still under the history, and the image is now the past image. We need a new image for the new generation to have a step for the future without being in the history. This is the role of the media.
I must argue from my personal experience here in Germany, seeing the younger generation grow up and seeing young journalists coming into the media, even in Germany, which tends to be a slightly less internationalized environment than the UK, I would say that the people who are making the news, to use that cliche, that personnel is changing dramatically and for the best, I would suggest. Very, very much.
Sorry, it's fallen to me to do the cheeky comments, it seems, but I was just a question to Peter. Maybe the solution is not to have a Deutsche Welle, but to have a European Welle, maybe.
Well, the whole notion of it is very interesting. I have a talk show on Deutsche Welle, and we have, each week I have a leading member of German society, and an awful lot of these people in the last couple of years have been members, leading members of the Turkish, Kurdish community or whatever, all sorts of different people. Some of them are German, some of them are not Germans. But what has changed in Germany, what has changed dramatically, is that each of these communities are now speaking for themselves. And I think that was something that it took an awful long while for the penny to drop in that respect. It really, really did. I'm very optimistic about these things in Germany, and I think certainly the representatives of what people choose to call minority communities in Germany feel very much more comfortable. This is a very interesting thing about the press. People have we saw things happening in the banlieue in France. We saw things happening in the Netherlands and what have you. We saw things happening in Austria, and people kept saying, well, when's it going to happen in Germany? It's bound to happen in Germany. And I kept saying to people, all sorts of representatives of minority communities here in Germany, saying, is it going to happen? Where is the anger there? Are these problems perhaps more, is there more anger in Germany, potentially sort of pent-up anger? People were saying, no, we feel actually very comfortable with this country. And the British media wouldn't have that.
I'm sorry. There is no future without past. So the UK, precisely. Why do you think that the German is being forgotten when you talk about the colonialism? Because in February 26, 1885, Africa was partitioned here in Berlin. But when you talk of colonialism today, you only read it in paper, books, but most of the blame goes to the UK. Could you tell me why?
Well, one reason, of course, is that we took over a lot of German colonies in Africa after Germany was defeated in the First World War. I mean, so Germany managed to get out of the colonialism business before it turned unpopular, as it were. Which turns out to be a huge historical benefit to Germany. I mean, those of us who are left with the residue of colonialism, it is a burden, because you find yourself, any obviously proud population, having been ruled by someone else for quite a long time, will resent that, however well or badly they were ruled. I like to hope, and I think, as I say, in the UK attitudes are changing, and I rather hope that in some of our previous colonies too, attitudes are changing, and there'll be more willingness to recognise that, okay, it was very humiliating to be ruled by the British, but there's nothing we can do about that. But maybe the British presence brought some good things. I was recently in Singapore, which is an extraordinarily flourishing, rich place. And it's a place which, it's not quite a democracy, but almost. It has very good universities. It has the rule of law. It has protection of human rights in general, unless you happen to be an opposition MP. And it functions extraordinarily well. And they are they're quite unashamed about the fact that they have taken what they view as the best of the British heritage. And the Central Square in Singapore, I recommend to you, is a cricket pitch. What more can you say about the benefits that the UK has brought to Singapore and the world?
I would like to make a final comment to the African colonies and the German colonies in general. I think there is, if you read Russell Berman is an American scholar, and he wrote about the Deutsche Sonderweg. The German colonies were kind of a special colonialization. Germany came to the colonization very, very late in the game. There wasn't that much left, I must say, and they took whatever was left. And German colonialism was also a very short period of time compared to the other colonial empires. But your criticism is absolutely correct. You don't hear enough and read enough about it. And if you Google 10 years ago, post-colonialism, colonialism, on a German website you would have maybe 150 entries. On a US American you would have 50,000 probably, and a British as well. I must say that World War II and the Holocaust overshadowed the colonial past. And only recently, only in the exactly past 10 years, here in Berlin, with Professor Klaus Scherpe, did we start looking at the German colonial past and actually looking at it from an academic point of view. So there's still a lot to be done. I mean, there was the 100th anniversary, and I hate using the term anniversary, of the Herero-Aufstand. That was at least written up in Der Spiegel at the time. But that's just marginal. And as long as Germany can't somehow get over the obstacle, the hurdle of World War II, we cannot even begin to talk about World War I and then the time before that. I mean, we're talking about World War I at least now, but that means going back even further. And after all, I mean, the loss of the colonies in 1914 already, that was a big hit to the German Empire as well. I mean, that was really nothing that Germany was proud of, and we suffered. The nation suffered from that loss. And hopefully there will be enough scholars in the future, because that's where it starts with the scholars, to tackle that part of history, that more is being written. But we have a lot of beautiful authors like Uwe Timm, who wrote a wonderful novel, Morenga, about the Herero Häuptling, Morenga, uprising. There are bits and pieces, but by far not enough. And again, that's just, we have to go backwards with, dealing with our history.
Okay, I think we should leave it there. We've had 2 hours, very good discussion. Yeah. I don't know if I don't think I can say anything that would necessarily conclude it. I'm happy that both countries are still in each other's comfort zones. Yeah. We'll leave it there. Thank you to all 4 panelists. Yeah.